Is this to send it live to YouTube?
Yeah. Which camera do you use?
This little one here.
Yep.
And you just use the one camera here.
Yeah.
You know, I have a little device. It's a video mixer. You can mix
Okay.
4 cameras.
Wow.
Or 3 cameras and a computer.
Brilliant.
And it's only a little thing this size.
Right.
Very good.
Okay.
You should get one.
Amr? Amr? Amr. So check if we're live.
We're gonna get ready.
Go live.
Let me switch
Go.
on.
Yep. It's going to come on to me, yes.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. I'd ask you all to please be seated. If anyone would like a chair to sit on, there are some at the back, you can feel free to help yourself.
Yeah.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. As-salatu was-salamu ala Rasulillahi amma ba'd. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. And thank you for attending today's RED events. Just for housekeeping, there's no planned fire drills. If there is a big fire, follow me, I'll be running the fastest. We have an exit over here at the front, and we also have the 2 exits that you came in from. We also have a side exit as well, if that's necessary. So please be aware of that. And our places to meet after we exit are in the back car park and out in the front on the other side of the road. Also, please can I ask that you turn your phones off, and I will make sure that mine's the same, inshallah. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce you to my friend and colleague, the Reverend Jonathan Aitken. Jonathan has had a distinguished career, including being a celebrated author, having begun his career in journalism, and as a former Conservative politician, during which time he was a potential candidate for becoming Prime Minister. In 1999, Jonathan was imprisoned for perjury, serving 7 months. And it was during this period of his life that he found his faith in God. And in 2019, Jonathan was ordained as an Anglican priest. Born in Dublin, Jonathan contracted TB at the age of 4, remarkably staying in hospital for 4 years, after which he went to live with his parents in Suffolk and had to learn to walk again. Jonathan attended Eton College and went on to read law at Christ Church College, Oxford, and followed his father's footsteps, becoming a journalist and then on to becoming an MP. Journalism in Vietnam proved to be quite an adventure. And as a young journalist in Yorkshire between 1968 and 1970, Jonathan was the very first person to be televised on Yorkshire TV when it began broadcasting. After his career in journalism, Jonathan moved to the City of London, where he was a successful investment banker, specializing in the Gulf and Saudi Arabia. In 1974, Jonathan was elected as a Member of Parliament. His ministerial offices included being Minister of State for Defence and Chief Secretary of the Treasury, which was a cabinet position. In 1999, Jonathan pled guilty to perjury and was imprisoned. It was through this experience that Jonathan found his faith, having studied the Bible, learning Greek, and returning to Oxford to study Christian theology. He currently works as a minister at St. Matthew's Church, Westminster, and also as a chaplain in HMP Pentonville. Jonathan has written at least 19 books, including award-winning biographies of the President Richard Nixon and of Margaret Thatcher. Jonathan Aitken set up the Chance to Change Foundation in 2019 with the help of his close friend, the late Mick May, who sadly passed away in April of this year. I am also one of the founding trustees of this charity, which helps to rehabilitate prisoners. A warm welcome to you, Reverend Jonathan Aitken.
Well, Assalamu alaikum. It's a great honor and privilege to be with you this evening. And obviously, this is my first visit to your center. And I do congratulate you in creating such a center, which I know will have taken a huge amount of work and effort in the community. And I know that part of your work is reaching out to serve the community. And it's very good of you to invite visitors like myself to come and share a few thoughts with you. I'm going to talk for about 25 minutes or so, and I'm going to break my talk up into 3 parts, and I'll put the headlines for these 3 parts are failure, faith, and fulfillment. You might have thought from Shafiq's rather too generous introduction that my life had been a long way from failure. That wasn't actually true for a long time. And I suspect that when I look at this audience here tonight, that many of you are successes in your businesses and your lives, and you probably don't think too often about what might happen if by any chance everything went wrong, if life went pear-shaped and you became a failure. And that is what happened to me, but it was a very interesting learning experience. I didn't use less complimentary adjectives than interesting at the time, but I went through a very dramatic series of very self-inflicted wounds. And I was, from having been up there, Shafiq rather generously said, tipped as a future Prime Minister, that it's actually not an exclusive compliment. If I was to be able to get hold of all the people who've been tipped as future Prime Ministers here, just think of them all, a lot of them known to me, Kinnock, Clark, hasn't time to go on through a list of, you'd actually fill this centre and there wouldn't be any room for them to stand. So it's not the most exclusive thing, but if you are tipped as a future Prime Minister, it rather goes to your head a bit and you begin to think you can walk on water and do all kinds of things, and you don't necessarily need to keep to every rule. Anyway, I made the great mistake of telling a lie on oath in a libel case and was caught out, and my life then went into free fall. And I sometimes say that I went through the experiences of defeat, disgrace, divorce, bankruptcy, and jail. As you can probably imagine, that's a pretty good royal flush of crises by anyone's standards. And I certainly therefore know what failure feels like. And interesting to look back, when I was in the process of failing, the newspapers couldn't wait to say, well, we'll never hear from him again. You know, he's absolutely finished, this awful man. So I know the pain and the noise which accompanies failure. I wrote a biography, as Shafiq mentioned, of Richard Nixon, America's 37th president. And you might say that his career ended in catastrophic failure. He was the only president ever to have to resign in disgrace. But Nixon used to say to me quite often, chatting really about himself, he used to say, failure is not falling down. Failure is falling down and not getting up again to continue life's race. And there's wisdom in that observation. Anyway, let me just tell you a little bit about the failure part of my story. I'll pick it up at the moment when I had traveled from the Central Criminal Court, the Old Bailey, to Belmarsh Prison. And I arrived in Belmarsh Prison, and like everybody else, you come off a van, you're put into handcuffs, and you're put into a iron-barred reception area, which is known as the cage, because that's where all the incoming prisoners who've been sentenced from jails all over London, Southeast England, are put. I remember the scene in that cage as long as I lived. It was like sort of the Wild West. Men were pouring in from courts all over Britain, practically, not just London, where I'd come from, but from quite far out. And with the habitual optimism of criminals, they had, most of them thought that they would be found not guilty, or if that went wrong, the judge would give them a lenient sentence. But by the time you're in the cage, reality is really dawning. You're facing a 5-year sentence, in my case, an 18-month sentence, and reality is hitting you very hard. But people go wild under those circumstances. Some go wild sort of downwards, their heads in their hand, burying faces and weeping. Some get rather violent. I remember one gang all fighting one another and shouting at one rather younger member of the gang, "You got the script wrong, you got the script wrong, that's why we're in here," and then hitting him. And there was a tremendous amount of noise and uproar and sounds of gloom and doom. In the middle of this, a prison officer suddenly tapped me on the shoulder and said, "Aitken, you've got to go and see the prison psychiatrist." Now, I knew I was having a bad day, but I didn't think I quite needed the services of a psychiatrist. But I didn't realize then that every prisoner has to see a psychiatrist just to check out whether or not they are a suicide risk. Anyway, to get the comedy, the humor of the moment that I'm going to tell you about next, I need to remind some of you, particularly the younger ones, that my sentencing had not gone unnoticed by the great British media and the great British public. In fact, I was probably the most notorious prisoner ever, because it hadn't been since the days of the Tudors that a cabinet minister had actually gone to jail. I think things have changed a bit since, but back there in the 1990s, I was the first ever cabinet minister since the days of Henry VIII or something to go to jail. So this was a big, big media event, and I had been followed with television cameras for days and so on. And I was the most famous, or rather most notorious man in Britain, practically. And indeed, when I arrived in HMP Belmarsh, there was 200 cameramen and others, reporters, all transmitting live on the 6 o'clock news that I was in the jail. But when I got into the prison psychiatrist had not been tuning into the media. So all this excitement had completely passed him by, and I was just another anonymous prisoner needing to be checked out. So he said to me, "You've got to answer some questions. Name, prison number, date of birth, next of kin. Does your next of kin know you're in prison?" And the next question was, "Does anyone other than your next of kin know you're in prison?" And I thought of those satellite dishes, TV cameras. So I tried to note a few, and I said, "Matter of fact, I think perhaps 10 or 12 million people now are in prison by now." The psychiatrist did not return my joke with a smile. I said, "What? Do you mean to tell me you're really saying that do you think 10 or 12 million people know you're in prison? Do you?" And then his tone became gentler and more clinical. He said, "May I ask you, prisoner CB 9298, have you in your life ever suffered from delusions?" Well, my delusions were getting shed pretty briskly that day. But eventually I got into prison and got into the life of prison. And it wasn't easy. Being a Tory cabinet minister was not the most popular thing to be in HMP Belmarsh, but I kept my head down and minded my own business and managed to get on with people a bit. Then I had a fantastic stroke of luck, which transformed my life in prison. It really transformed my life. I wouldn't be a prison chaplain now if it hadn't happened. But my third or fourth day, I was standing around doing nothing, which is what you do most of the time in prison, and minding my own business. And suddenly a young prisoner comes up to me and says in a sort of conspiratorial whisper, he says, "Hey, I've got a problem. I've had a letter from my brief. My problem is I can't read it. Could you read it to me?" So I read it to him, and it was a letter from his solicitor, attaching one from the Lambeth Council, saying he was going to be evicted for non-payment of rent from his council flat in Lambeth. And his wife and his small child would also be evicted. And this news, as I read it out to him, sent this guy up the wall, shouting, screaming, yelling, and the only coherent theme in it was after saying, "My wife, my kid are going to be on the street. What shall I do? What shall I do? What shall I do?" Well, considering we were both prisoners in Belmarsh, he could not have found a more expert source of advice to ask this question too. Why? Because as a backbench MP, I, for the last 26 years, had been doing eviction cases for my constituents. So I knew absolutely all the rules and the wrinkles and how to get a bit more time by getting somebody to pay £2 a week and so on, how to postpone an eviction. So I said, you say these things, make these applications, you will postpone your eviction by some months probably. And he thought this was brilliant. And he said, "Well, how do I do that?" I said, "We just write a letter to the Lambeth Council putting these points in, and your eviction will not take place quickly." And he then said, "Hey, I've got another problem. I don't do no reading nor no writing neither. Could you write it?" So I wrote a letter of appeal to the Lambeth Council, and he was kind enough to say it was quite good. And then he signed it. And then instead of doing anything you might have expected, like putting the letter in the letterbox or putting it in his pocket, instead he did something completely unexpected with this letter. He turned himself into an 18th century town crier, and he went down the wing holding the letter aloft and shouting at the top of his voice, he says, "Hey guys, this MP geezer of ours, he's got fantastic joined up writing." Now, this testimonial to my graphological skills fell on the ears of a very receptive audience, because one of the big problems in prison, about a third of all prisoners cannot read or write properly. And we say rather glibly, we're going to rehabilitate prisoners, we're going to find them jobs. Hang on, if people can't even read the labels on a tin in a warehouse, how employable are they? And so rehabilitation is a bit more tricky than you might think. Anyway, thanks to the town crier, my life changed. From that moment onwards, the word got round that there was an MP geezer who was a prisoner who was willing to write letters for fellow prisoners. And every night in my sentence from then on, there was a queue outside my cell of people wanting letters read for them and written for them, often on the most intimate subjects imaginable. In fact, a joke went around the prison, and I remember an old hag said to me after about 6 weeks, he said, "Hey, Jono, do you realize all this letter writing business of yours, you is making a fantastic impact on the girls of Brixton. They can't believe the sudden improvement in the love letters they're getting from this lady." But be that as it may, I was making some friends. And I started to get to know my fellow prisoners very, very well, as you do when you're writing letters to their girlfriends or to their any kind of friends or relationships. And I began to understand all kinds of things about the kind of people who go into prison. They're not necessarily excuses for their crimes, but there are sometimes explanations for their crimes. You probably have all grown up in good Muslim families where you've had dads who said, "Well done, son," or mums who said, "I'm so proud of you." Suddenly I was meeting a lot of people who spent most of their growing up years in care, where they didn't know who their fathers were. They hadn't had any sort of love and encouragement And so perhaps it's not so surprising that some of them had no standards and roots and disciplines. Anyway, I got fascinated by this community, which I'd never expected to be part of, which is, the prison life of and the people who are in prison. And it had an enormous impact on what I am doing now and my later life. I should lead on towards my next heading, faith, by telling you about one particular prisoner who was an Irish burglar called Paddy. And he seemed to have a rather complicated love life. I wrote many letters, many girlfriends to him, for him. And one evening he came to my cell or invited me to his cell to have a cup of coffee. That's a big mark of trust for one prisoner to another. And when I got into the cell, we had the usual kind of conversation, because time is not of the essence of prison life. A long talk about, our mistakes, our families, what we were going to do next when we came out, all these kind of things. And then after this rather warm, intimate conversation, Paddy suddenly changed gear, and the conversation became much more formal. It was as though he was giving a vote of thanks at the Bowls Club or something. It was suddenly very formal. He said, "Hey, John, on behalf of the lads, I've been deputed to thank you for all these letters you've been writing for me and others. And we've decided we're going to give you a gift. And I've been put in charge of the gift. And the gift is," he died with a tatty cardboard box. The gift is that you can have, free of charge, anything you like to choose from my library. And then he spread out in front of me an amazing selection of hardcore porn magazines. And after a fleeting moment of temptation, I said, "Thanks, but no thanks, Paddy." But I also said it in a sort of tone that I was going back to being a pompous politician. And Paddy got angry and he said, "Why are you saying no? Why are you saying no? Are you sneering at me? Are you looking down on me? Are you judging me?" So I said, "No, I used to like those kind of magazines, but I'm on a different path these days." "Oh, what kind of path would that be then?" I said, "Well, I didn't want to answer this question, but I said, well, as a matter of fact, I'm sort of stumbling towards finding a faith, seeking a faith." And Paddy said, "Oh, my nan, she used to believe in all that Jesus stuff. Maybe there's something in it. How do I get on that path then? How do I get on that path?" He looked at me as though I was some sort of expert, and which I certainly was not. I was nowhere in my journey of faith. But I said rather nervously, "Well, Paddy, the way you pray, that's what you do, you pray." I said, "Well, how do you pray then?" He looked at me rather sternly, and I said, "Well, you just pray. You ask God to help you, forgive you." And so Paddy and I pray, talk about the blind leading the blind. The first night, second night, third night, fourth night. And then Paddy said, "Oh," he said, "this stuff's too good just to keep to the two of us." And I thought he had the idea of bringing in another Irish burglar to make our little twosome, a threesome. Not a bit. Paddy had lots of energy, lots of charm, and he really got the qualities of a good army recruiting sergeant. So he shot around the jail saying, "Any more to come and pray with me and Jono tonight? Come to cell 321B on the threes." And that night, about 8 or 9 people turned up. I can remember their names, but the occupations perhaps rather more interesting. There was a blagger who was an armed robber. There was a blower who cracked safes for a living. There was a kiter who was an exotic fraudster who didn't just bounce a few checks, he bounced so many of them they flew around like kites. There were a couple more Irish burglars. There was an arsonist. There was a couple of lifers who were murderers. It gave a new meaning to the Christian term, a cell group, to have this rather strange lot altogether. And we started to pray. I haven't got time to tell you all things that happened, but it was an extraordinary. Suddenly, these people really, we had a go at praying together, and that was the beginning of my journey of faith. And prison is actually a wonderful place to pray, and you've got all this time to start. Secondly, you're locked up in a cell. You've got if you're sensible, I think you're in prison, which not everybody is. You think about how you might change, you might about where you've gone wrong, and there are chaplains, Muslim, Christian, others, to help you. And so I had quite an interesting journey of searching for faith in prison. I wasn't quite sure where I was getting, but I was on the move, on searching. I just pause for a moment. Well, perhaps I could go on. The one other thing I did after I came out of prison, I decided I wanted to know more about faith, and I started to look at distance learning courses, and then I got a chance to go to a really complete career change, to go and study theology. So I chose the one place in Britain which had worse food than a prison and more uncomfortable beds than a prison. This was a training college for Anglican priests and monks in Oxford, called Wycliffe Hall, Oxford. So I went there for 3 years and got a degree. And it was a very good time in my life to be a sort of student again, having to write essays every week. And I learned an awful lot about the Christian faith, a little bit about the Muslim faith, and I can tell you something, because Shafiq mentioned it, that I knew something about the Muslim faith from a rather unusual angle. I used to work as a banker for part of the royal family of Saudi Arabia, who needed to serve very good clients. And and in particular, a man called Crown Prince Fahd, who later became King Fahd, and his son. And I was really quite close to both of them personally. And we used to go out into the desert. And that was one Saudi prince or a Saudi gentleman really wants to enjoy himself. And they didn't go to the movies or to the pub. They head out into the desert and go into a completely wild, empty part of the desert. And they have a quiet evening and they cook a lamb and they talk into the night sky. But they always, of course, pray. And I was amazed at the discipline of those prayers. I do speak a little Arabic, but not enough to follow the prayers well. But I said, you know, these guys have got something. I mean, that they are so disciplined that they pray this often, this hard, this seriously. And I used to have to talk sometimes with some of the imams. What was it all about? What was different between Christian faith and the Islamic faith? And it was just interesting. But the seriousness and the discipline. We Christians pray, but we don't pray with anything like the discipline and the regularity and the frequency. And in my own prayer life now, I still draw inspiration for from my things I learned sort of about prayer from Muslim friends in Saudi Arabia. Talking with Crown Prince Fahd, I always remember that his working day was quite unlike anybody else's. And he used to really do most of his business well after midnight, meetings, if he was going to discuss things in English politics and so on, 2 o'clock in the morning through. And finally, the evening would end because of Fajr, and he would go to the morning prayer, and all the rest of us would go to bed. I understand Amr is running a Fajr club here, and I feel I'm an honorary member of it already, having been trained by Crown Prince Fahd to wait until the dawn prayer came. But, and I'm sure some of you occasionally feel that maybe some of these prayers are just going through the motions. But of course they're not, because the discipline itself, and I know always a prayer before 6 in the morning, not quite as good as Fajr, well, in winter perhaps it is, but that disciplined life, having a serious prayer life, is, I think, at the heart of anybody's faith, and should be. We Christians have got a lot to learn from you. When I had finished my second sentence at Wycliffe Hall, Oxford, which was rather tougher and longer than my prison sentence in Belmont, I wondered what to do next. And I wasn't very employable. People who come out of prison usually have found it difficult to find a job. No one's going to take me back into politics. No one's going to take me back into banking. But I had some skills as a writer. I could write books and newspaper articles. And what really attracted me, I said, I'm never going to have the exciting, glamorous life again, but I could still have a very worthwhile life. After all, the whole point of being in politics is public service. That's finished for me, but what public service could I do? That's what I'd like to do, along with trying to earn a living. And so I said, well, I really am interested in prison ministry. You don't have to be a vicar to do things in prison ministry. You can do all kinds of things, charity work. So I did a lot of going into prisons and helping the chaplains, but helping other people as well in kind of rehabilitation of prisoners' work, getting people jobs after they came out of prison. I worked, Shafiq mentioned, a great mutual friend of ours, Mick May, worked in charities to help people in this rather specialist area, but I had a good insight to it. So I did a lot of that. I did find it quite fulfilling. And the third part of my talk, which we're now coming to, is fulfillment. Somewhere along the line, I don't know whether any of you do this in your prayers, but I, from time to time, used to say to God, is there anything else you'd like me to do? Anything more you'd like me to do? And to my amazement, one morning I was just saying this, and the voice seemed to say, actually, I want you to be ordained. I want you to be a priest. And I really more or less said, God, please shut up. This is a ridiculous idea. Me being a priest, I'm too old, I'm not worthy of it, not good enough, and last thing I want to be is a vicar. Please forget this idea if it's you talking. But the nagging voice went on, and then it did change and said, actually, I meant I want you to be a priest and a prison chaplain. And that did make sense to me, because inside a prison, there are shorter Christian prison chaplains. It's a great calling. But even so, I was nervous and hesitant and said, I'm not sure, I'm too old really. Over 70 now. I don't think it's really right for me. And then when I was thinking about this, somebody sent me a little verse of doggerel poetry, 4 or 5 lines. And it was written by a man who was, in his day, as famous as Ben Stokes is today, because the man was called C.T. Studd, and he was captain of the English cricket team. And C.T. Studd, who was captain of the first ever English cricket team to go out and play the Ashes series against Australia, was a sort of at university and then county cricket and test cricket, a national hero. And suddenly he said, I want to go into the church. God is calling me to serve him. And the Church of England, oh, wonderful. C.T. Studd, the great cricket captain, wants to be in the church. He'll be a bishop in no time. Wonderful news. But C.T. Studd said, no, don't want to go in the main church. I want to be a prison chaplain. And everyone said, why? It's one place you won't be a bishop. You get stuck into that backwater. And then C.T. Studd got so tired of explaining to me why he wanted to be a prison chaplain that he wrote these 3 or 4 lines of verse. And someone sent them. And the verses go, some want to live within the sound of church or chapel bell. I want to run a rescue shop within a yard of hell. When I read that, I said, actually, that's what I'd really like to do. The challenges of prison ministry. Shafiq has been a prison chaplain. He knows, and I know, that looking after prison ministry is a tough call. There are troubles every day, dramas ranging from attempted or real suicides to broken homes to all kinds of dramas. but is never a dull moment as a prison chaplain. So I did sign on, and I was ordained. That's why I'm wearing a dog collar here tonight. I love being a prison chaplain. It's been the best time in my life. I'm very fulfilled and happy doing it. First of all, I'm now over 80. Who else says, come on, we really need you, when you're 80 years old, come and do a job. So A, I love it. B, I really help some people. C, things can go very badly, but things also go wonderfully well. It will help people through their troubles, get them out the other side. The saddest thing about prison is the lack of hope. And so many people, when they get into prison, they think it's all over. Life is finished. And some signs that many of them is true. They won't give up their drugs. They go back to crime. But a significant percentage, if encouraged, don't go back to crime and do get on the straight and narrow. And helping them do that is a very fulfilling and demanding task. And Shafiq and I, and the man we mentioned, Mikmay, joined forces. We now run a charity called Chance to Change, which specifically helps people in all kinds of quite original and constructive ways to get people on the straight and narrow. And there's a great gap, I may say, for Muslim prisoners who have particular problems, which is their families very often disown them. And so they can't go back to their families. So finding jobs for them, finding places where they can go and be welcomed, that's a big calling. And if any of you are interested in this work, and it'd be a great thing for a centre such as yours to get involved in it, well, Shafiq will tell you how, but first thing is, actually, I invite some of you now to come to Penville Prison, see what we're trying to do, see what we're trying to do on the outside, and then maybe your centre could be helpful in all kinds of interesting ways. Thought for the evening. I hope you feel at the end of this talk you've heard a few words from somebody who's actually very happy, very fulfilled. That's not how it looked when I was going through defeat, disgrace, divorce, bankruptcy, and jail. And lots of things went wrong. I've perhaps glossed over some of the things that went wrong, but many more things went right. And they went right, again, more than anything else, because of faith was a guiding star, and prayer was a guiding star, and friends were a guiding star in this story I'm telling you about. So it's a story, I hope you feel some hope and encouragement. I hope it's been interesting to listen. I've gone on far too long already, so now I'll open up to questions. Over to you if you'd like to ask questions. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Reverend, for your eloquent words and sharing your journey with us. Fascinating. And also for the Blood or Fudger Club. You're welcome anytime, as long as you bring donuts and yogurts. So we're just opening up to questions now. So anything from the floor. While you're waiting, just a quick icebreaker from me, Reverend. Any advice on how to find your faith without going to prison?
Sorry.
Any advice on how to find your faith without going to prison?
Yes, lots. I think the first step is to have curiosity, and curiosity beyond the day-to-day superficial things that go right, because almost all of us, even when we're doing things well, like in business, in money, in enjoying ourselves, we wonder if there could be something more. We each, whatever our backgrounds have been, whatever our faiths have been, there is a spiritual hunger in each and every one of us, which is just there, and it makes us curious. So the first thing is to be curious about, is there something more than the thing that the material world, that the secular world offers? Looking around the secular world, isn't doing all that well. But many of us are dissatisfied with the secular world. But are we curious? Are we willing to start to search? If we are, the next thing I think is to find someone who will help you search. Almost everyone in something like a center like this, or a mosque or a church, there are good people who will come alongside. And if I think on my own journey, I owe an enormous amount to people who said, hey, have you tried reading the Gospels? Have you tried thinking more deeply? And I was not without some faith education. But I was at best what I would call a half Christian, which I now know is about as useful as being half pregnant. But at the time, I thought it was absolutely fine to just turn up in a church every so often and say the right words and not really do anything about it. And it was people who got me going, so you must go deeper. You must think of what the great teachings of faith are and what you should follow. And then I mentioned then get into the discipline of searching, which means really praying, going and listening to the reading. So faith is a journey, and it's having the courage to get on the journey and then stick on the journey. One of the greatest English sailors of all time was somebody called Francis Drake, who did all kinds of wonderful things in the reign of Queen Elizabeth, including beating the Spanish Armada. But he was also a good Christian general, and he wrote a prayer which is perfectly appropriate for all faiths, and it's called the Prayer of Perseverance. And it has a line which goes, when we're given to endeavor any great matter, grant us to know that it is not the beginning, but the continuing of the same unto the end, until it be thoroughly finished, which yieldeth the true glory. So persevering with faith on the journey of faith, it never ends, I might say, as far as I can see. You're always searching, always learning more, always working at it. I think, so being curious, being willing to search, finding companions on the journey, and persevering with the journey. And the rewards are wonderful.
Thanks so much. Yeah, curiosity seems to be a buzzword at the moment, but anyone else have questions? David, of course.
You said you started to pray. Was your conversion to Christ a process, or was there a definite time when you could say you turned from darkness to light and found Christ?
Many speakers, especially Christian speakers, are very dramatic when they tell you that there is a moment when suddenly a blinding flash of light comes down and bingo, you are a committed Christian, a committed man of God. Obviously, that works for a lot of people. But I think a lot of people, for whom that's not true, and it wasn't true for me. For me, it was much more like a journey, which there wasn't any one miracle moment, flash of light. I went along that road of faith, stumbling, falling, backsliding, sinning, doubting, and yet, there was a certain momentum which kept going against some of my instincts at the time. And rather like a journey when, in the old days at least, you used to go across Europe, and you used in trains in the night, you used to cross frontiers, and suddenly you'd hear you're crossing the French frontier, or the Belgian frontier, or the German frontier, and they'd be shouting. And I didn't really have much of that. There does come a moment when you realize you've arrived, you actually believe you've got there. And so I had a difficult, slow journey of a lot of failures before I arrived, but I did know when I had arrived in the country of a real and committed faith. It took time. Yeah, I think I can hear you, so yeah. I'll repeat your question.
Yeah, I don't know if you read the news recently about the the decline of the numbers of the people who are defining themselves as Christians in
Yes.
this country. And what's your take on that? And do you think that the government should do something about it?
Well, number one, the government shouldn't do anything about it because we live in a state in which the government is not a government of faith. It's a government of practical secular decisions about taxes. So the government needn't do anything. I really don't worry at all about the latest Gallup poll of how many Christians there are, how many Muslims there are. Because first of all, whether it's Christians or it's Muslims, we don't know. We don't have light searchlights going to people's hearts. How many of them are real? How many are genuine? But and it doesn't surprise me at all that I think it's now 47% of the British public say they're Christians, and the other 53% say they're not. But the ones who say they're not, maybe people of other faiths, like people who are part of the Muslim faith, a very large section now. But I think God is not in the numbers game. God is in the human hearts game. And I think, in fact, of those, there are probably many more people who may, at certain times in their life, turn to God. There's an old verse which says, and almost everyone, when plague or the disease or sorrow strikes him, inclines to think there is a God or someone very like him. And so we do turn to God in moments of pressure, bereavement, worry. So I think Gallup polls and measurements of church attendances are interesting, but I don't think they really matter.
Thank you. Any more questions?
I was just curious, did any of the other Christians that you prayed with, did any of those terms come to you now?
Sorry, I didn't quite hear.
Did any of the other people that prayed with Paddy and so forth, did they turn to God as well?
Oh, yes. That's a very good story. First of all, on Paddy, I saw him this week, and I became godfather of the Christian type to his child, who was born when I was in prison. Paddy actually became what you might call an OTG Christian. He was completely over the top with this drama of his conversion. Hasn't stopped him going back to prison once or twice, but he is actually a seriously committed man. He's now getting on a bit, because all the story I'm telling you about sounds like yesterday. It was actually 25 years ago. So Paddy is now a man in his 50s, but he is definitely a committed. And this prayer group, which I didn't have time to tell you about, well, it had its ups and downs, but actually a lot of them became people who prayed. And we had a Muslim who was in the prayer group throughout, who was rather amused by some of the things the Christians said, but nevertheless, we all prayed. So it was a journey of searching, but a journey of praying. And yes, it had some very, very good results.
Thank you.
As someone who's done particularly well in Boston, as someone who's done particularly well in two separate roles, one in politics and one in banking, which you mentioned, how's it in retrospect, now that you are your age, and you have mentioned that the crime for which you are performing, when you look at the other MPs and prime ministers of England and see what they've done, I'll give two examples. One of them being Tony Blair and the murder and execution, the pre-prepared murder and execution of over 1 million brown people in Iraq, which they knew to be an unjust war in advance of the war taking off. And secondly, the more recent events related to COVID-19 and the awarding of contracts for PBI, whatever you want to call it, to friends and family, to wives and so on and so forth, of fellow MPs and peers and lords. When you look at what they've done and got away with it, and literally got away with it, and made a handsome profit from it. Because I think Tony Blair's first year or two after being stepping down as PM, his company made 30 million just advising the same people, the same families that you represent in the banking as a sort of an advisor to the family, to the Saudi families. How does it feel for yourself in retrospect? You look at what I got done for. I think what these guys get away with, because what you did pales in significance when you look at what these guys have done and what they continue to do, both morally, from a religious point of view, and legally.
Actually, I've got a confession to make. I managed to leave my hearing aids behind when I came out tonight. I think I got the main theme of the question. If I didn't, just come back. One of the very good things Jesus said in the Sermon on the Mount was, "Judge not, that ye be not judged." Now you're trying to tempt me, I think, into saying that this or that prime minister or this or that politician did much worse things than I did. Now, I won't say that. I think that maybe I may have some sneaking sympathy for your views, but I think we all have to sort of live with ourselves. As far as I was concerned, I mean, I told a lie on oath about whether my wife's hotel bill in Paris had been paid by me or by somebody else. And really, it's not a very serious crime, you might say. On the other hand, the law is anyone who says something on oath in a court which is untrue, they can be prosecuted for perjury. Actually, perjury is one of the most frequent crimes committed every day in our courts. But I don't think it's necessarily unfair that if you're in a position of trust and you break the law, that the law comes down pretty hard on you. I mean, there are all kinds of things, in my case, political views, newspapers, and shouting. But it was my fault. I did break the law, and there is a crime called perjury, and it, although it's rare for prosecutions to, so I have no complaint about that at all. I think it would be a good thing if more politicians went to jail. Not because they necessarily done these such terrible crimes, but they would then understand, as I now understand, much more about things that go on in our society. And I think something which is deeply resented, which is when, and Jesus was almost toughest on this, the hypocrisy of those who say one thing and do another. And politicians are a bit apt to fall to that particular sin and to say things, whether it's about wars or whether it's about business deals. They are tempted by that, and they often fall prey to that temptation. But I think we should look after our own souls, clean them up, and we can criticize, but don't be too hot to judge those who we think may have sinned in ways which are worse than ours. So I'm a fellow traveller with you, but I have to get off 1 or 2 stops before your train crashes into the buffers at the terminus.
Any more questions?
Ladies want to ask a question?
Thank you so much, Jonathan. Can you hear me clearly?
I'll translate. Can you hear me clearly? Clearly not.
Just so it's my hearing aids.
I'll translate, it's fine.
No, thank you so much. That was a really super question. It was last asked, actually, and something along those lines. Had you, it's a little bit personal, I hope you don't mind, but had you continued your journey as a politician and hadn't been, sort of sentenced as you were, the libel, you know, your life would have been very different now. But just looking back in retrospect, you're 18, you look fantastic, and I think God has had grace on you. Would you say to you, do you wish you came across Christianity and God when you were much younger? And do you regret things, or do you just see it as a journey? Because my father always said when he came to religion later, that he didn't necessarily regret what happened before, because his journey led him to where he ended. Would you advise young people from a background similar to yours and not prisoners, who perhaps have, they're in a society where they have money, education, and you can see they live in a secular, normal manner, to think about God? Do you preach around to, I suppose, you're based in Westminster, so it's a very different environment, and people, do you do politicians come to your church, and do you preach to cabinet ministers? I'm just trying to think how, you give back to people that you were around before. Thank you.
All right. I'm sorry, combination of fuzzy microphone and my hearing is, but I think I got
I'm
most
sure
of
there's a
it.
question in there somewhere.
The most salient point is that you look great for your age, and God has blessed you with His grace.
Well, and I think you asked some interesting things about youth and young people. When I was very small, very nearly died in a hospital with TB, which was a disease that was much more feared than cancer is today, because there was no cure until antibiotics came in 1949, and I'd already been in hospital 3 years. And I was nursed by nuns, and the nuns used to pray for me and teach me sort of how to pray and things like that. This was not quite as simple as a matter, because my grandmother was a very strong Protestant, and the nuns were Catholics, and she kept trying to stop them praying. So there's sort of crazy divisions, but without any question of doubt, I think that a background, a youthful training, even if it is rejected, even if it is forgotten about, it still leaves its mark and its imprint. And for example, I can vividly remember that particular nun who nursed me kneeling at the edge of my bed in the hospital, praying. And so maybe that's just as I was talking about those Saudis praying and leaving that impact on me. So that nun who used to come and kneel on the bed and pray. And I sometimes think in the world of faith, especially if you're a preacher, I think people are less interested in actually the preaching, the word, than they are by the example. If we live a good life, a good Muslim life, good Christian life, that makes far more of a message than anything said in a pulpit. And so we try and follow God's teachings, follow the example of Jesus or Muhammad, and that example is worth far more than theology. Even though I've got a degree in theology, I think most of it is not that impressive compared to the simple lives well led, faithful lives, faithful service. That's much, much more important. So if I look well at 80, I hope it's something to do with an inner peace rather than, I take vitamin pills, I jog, but like everybody over 80, I'm falling apart a bit. But I think I have found, which is the most important thing of all, is peace with God. And for that, I'm profoundly grateful.
When you lost your faith, was you bitter with God?
Sorry, Sadi?
When you lost your faith in this cage, when you sat down at the cage, were you be the with God?
Well, I'm not sure I've as well lost my faith dramatically. I yielded to the temptations of the world. Occasionally when I was an MP, at election time, some group or other used to come round and ask questions of the MP or the candidate. And these were sometimes Christian groups or faith groups, I know the Muslims coming, wanting to know what your faith was. And I used to think, gosh, these are cheesy questions, but I'll do my best. And one of the questions always was, what is your relationship with God? And I was thinking, well, I mean, I did have some sort of a relationship, but it was slightly like the relationship that I used to have with my bank manager in the days when bank managers were real people, not call centers in Bangladesh, but they were actually the banks, and you had to go in and see a bank manager. And now there are one or two things, both with God and with my bank manager. First of all, I did believe he knew he existed, to start. Secondly, I thought you were polite to him. And so I used to go and see the bank manager every so often. I used to go to church every so often. So there was a second step in the right direction. And the politeness included doing things that were right in the church. You would say amen at the right place. But where I really went wrong is that I thought all this time, whether with God or with the bank manager, I was in charge of the account and that I could call the shots my way. And when I wasn't in the bank, I could do what I wanted, go to the casino, and with God, I could, not on Sundays, but other days of the week, I could break all the rules. And of course, that is not a right relationship with God. One of the key elements in a relationship with God is obedience to God, and to imitate God, and to communicate with God. And so it wasn't so much that I lost my faith, it's like I lost my navigation points, I lost my disciplines. And I think it's quite easy to do in a very materialistic, secular world, and not doing it, keeping going. And I think if you keep the disciplines, if you pray as often as you Muslims do, and as I now try to do, I think you're doing something right, because you're all the time coming back to some of the great teachings, the great disciplines.
Thank you so much, Jonathan, for an honest and transparent discussion, sharing your life with us, sharing the difficulties that you went through. That's really appreciated. And on behalf of the community, we thank you. We'll now come to the side room, inshallah, have some food together, and we'll have further chance to talk. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Really good. Come join us. Okay.